evening, everybody. Hello. My name is Anat Admati. I am the faculty director of the Corporation Society Initiative, CASI, which is hosting this event. Also co-sponsoring is our new side collaboration with the Center for Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, Capitalism and Democracy. We're very excited to host here a historic event. Today, the authors, our guests, actually held the book for the first time right here. The book is only out on June 19th. So anybody here who got the book is way ahead of the rest who have to pre-order the book. So it was very exciting that they never got it, but we got it. It wasn't planned that way. Some of the background of this event and how we got to be here so early in this game was that Louise Story, one of the authors, who would be introduced in more detail by our moderator in a second, and I met after she moderated a 15 years after Lehman Brothers event in September. Last September, and moderated a panel I was on, and her stories were featured in my book, both the original edition 2013 and again in the 2024 edition that we had a previous event here about. And so I was very excited to meet her when I came to New York, and then she told me she's working on this book. And so we agreed right away that she will try to come here and still squeeze it into this academic year. And our student leaders were excited about this. And in particular, one of our outgoing leaders, Amira Hannon, got into this and did an amazing job preparing for this event, and she will be moderating. Amira is a member of a group of wonderful second-year MBA students who are going to graduate soon. And come in, there's a room in the front. We just had a little party last night to say goodbye to them, which we are not quite saying, so it's nice they're still here. And I just want to read their names quickly. You sort of met them in the different events. And so we're saying goodbye to them soon, but I hope to keep in touch with them. And we have a new group of incoming students, two of whom are sitting there doing the Zoom. And so in addition to Amira, we have Claudia Alvarez Pujol, who was moderating the previous event on Davos Men and was the director who kind of ran the show. Rachel Keatley, who's here. Tom Newcomb, who I'm not sure I saw, but moderated multiple events this year. Renata Stewart, who was involved in an event that we did on leadership with Jeff Pfeffer and Linda Ginzel. And Ryan Zapata, who was involved, as well as Jianming Wu, who was also from the MSX program, who was also very involved in all that we do. Thank you, leaders, for everything you've done. And now, without further ado, I'll let Amira take it from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Anat. And Ebony and Louise, we are so excited to have you here today at the GSB. It's not every day at the GSB that we get to talk about the intersection between race, money, and power. Although I will admit, maybe we talk a little bit more about the money and power part. It's really special to me that you guys agreed to come here. Last year, with one of our amazing classmates, Maya Watson, I did some independent research on the Black-white wealth gap, and I was just so struck by everything I learned, and I wondered why I didn't hear more conversations about this at the GSB and in all of my formal education. And so today is just so special, and thank you to everyone here in the audience for showing up with curiosity. I think this is just an incredible opportunity for us to all learn and grow together. And I want to make sure that we involve all of you. So about halfway through, we'll switch over to Q&A. So make sure, or Q&A from you all. I'll kick us off with some questions to start, but if you have any questions, even those in the audience on Zoom, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer everything. All right, so I'll get started. So Ebony, Louise, you both are longtime award-winning journalists who've covered a range of social and business issues, from local issues, Ebony, like the Cleveland public school system. I know you both reported both locally and nationally on the 2008 financial crisis. So what brought you both here together and to the topic of the Black-white wealth gap?
Well, in the summer of 2020, like a lot of people across the country, Amira, Louise, and I were having conversations about what was happening in society, what we'd seen in workplaces, what we had experienced. We started reading books together. If you all remember, it was that first pandemic summer. You really couldn't go anywhere. And we just started having, really deep conversations. And, a few months passed and another few months passed, and we realized, we hadn't read a book on the Black-white wealth gap that was the history of it, but brought it all the way to present day with real people, contemporary people that focused on the issues they face today because of things in our society right now, but also from the past. And so that's how we ended up coming together, to work on this project. Would you add anything to that, Louise?
Yeah, just to give a little bit of background on us also. So I had been at the New York Times for 12 years, and one of the very best and my very favorite editors is here. I'm so glad to see Glenn Cramon here. And you should all take his class if you haven't. And after I was at the New York Times for 12 years, I went to the Wall Street Journal. And while I was at the Wall Street Journal, I got to work with many great people, hire many great people. And one of the very best people that I convinced to come to the Wall Street Journal was Ebony.
Thank you.
And so that's how we met. We were working together at the Wall Street Journal the summer of 2020. And Ebony's job was to help the Wall Street Journal reach more audiences and to reach non-white audiences. And so she was working on that issue. I was running all of the coverage strategy in the summer of 2020. And so we were having a very active conversation, even just at work, about the pledges businesses were making. Were they real? Would they stick to them? What did readers think about Wall Street Journal coverage? How should demonstrations be covered? Things like a big topic in the press that summer was, would you capitalize the B in Black Americans? And as we were having these conversations at work, yes, we started having personal conversations, and we found we had a lot of shared values, and we had some shared experiences, but we also started understanding some of the different lived experiences that we had, some in part due to our race. And when we realized that there is no book in existence on the Black-white wealth gap through history, we decided that we were the pair to write it.
Well, I'm so glad you guys took the opportunity to write it. I think I've started reading the book and it's truly incredible. So I'm excited that many of our audience members gotten a copy. And if you didn't get a copy and you weren't early, make sure you pre-order a copy. It should be released in a few short weeks here. So you all did so much, like hundreds of interviews, street reporting, data analysis. And one of the big data points that stood out, which is also the title of your book, is 15 cents on the dollar. So could you explain to our audience, what does 15 cents on the dollar mean, and why did you pick this data point?
So 15 cents on the dollar is the amount of wealth that the typical Black family has when compared to the $1 in wealth a typical white family has. So every 3 years, the Federal Reserve has a survey that it puts out, and that survey is the Consumer Finance survey, and people share their wealth information. And I know Louise wants to talk more, about that.
Thanks, Ebony. So just to add one thing, you all may know what wealth is. You're business school students. Although I'll tell you, we jointly teach a class at Yale, at the Yale School of Management, and when we asked our students to define wealth to us, they came back with a lot of different definitions. So one of the reasons that wealth gaps are not very well understood is people have different understandings of what wealth is. People very commonly mix up wealth and income, and they think if someone has a lot of income, they have a lot of wealth. People also forget that wealth is assets minus liabilities. So they'll look at people's assets, like you've got a big house, and they'll think you have wealth, but you might have a lot of debt on that. Or they might look at someone who looks like they're doing really well financially, but not remember that that person has a lot of student loans, something that, by the way, is more common at greater amounts with Black Americans than white Americans. And so our number one goal for this project is to spread the data, to make 15 cents on the dollar a nationally recognized statistic, which we're hoping all of you all will help us with. So I just want to just quickly run through a little bit of data, but we're not going to have a lot of slides today, but so that you have this information. So as Ebony said, this is Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finance data. It comes out every 3 years. This just came out in October 2023. And here you can see the median wealth level for white, black, Hispanic, Asian, and what they call mixed race. And I just want to tell you that this is the first year they've ever broken Asian out of the other group. And so when we look at historical data, you'll see when you look, Asian doesn't have a separate line because it's in the other group. A couple more things I want to show you here. The number one question we've been getting as we've talked about this is when we say there's this big gap, that the typical black family has 15 cents on a dollar of wealth for the typical white family. Number one question we've been getting is, well, is that just because of the billionaires at the top? If you took out the top 20, 30 richest people, would the gap not be there? And so we're showing you here the median wealth by race as well as the mean wealth by race. And you all know what median and mean are, but showing this to you because if it was only about the people at the top, you all know that would affect the mean, but taking 20, 30 people out would not affect the median. And you can see this gap in the levels exist in both places and has a pretty similar shape. I'll also observe when you look at this, this data that you can also see kind of directionally what happened with wealth going up and down, and you can see the impact of the 2008 financial crisis, which is something we covered in the book and really looked at the impact on that by race, something that we think is a pretty fresh take. A couple more things to show you. This is a data set that goes all the way from 1860 to the present. And it was pieced together by Princeton economist Elora Davenport, who actually was out here at Stanford this year. Maybe some of you all encountered her with some economists from the University of Bonn. And when you look at this, this is the average white family's wealth divided by the average black family's wealth is what you're looking at here. So you can see right after the Civil War, it was about 58-1, okay? And they pieced this data together by looking at census records. You may not know this, but the 1860 and 1870 census asked people their wealth, and it was taken out of the census, and looking at property records and a variety of records. So when you look at this, it looks like, it went down a lot leading into 1900. That was because slavery was ended, and that was also because some black Americans did get land there. They managed to buy it then, despite there not being as much as people looked for with 40 acres and a mule. But then you can see it slows, but this looks like it's been a big drop, and some people would look at this and say, oh, it looks like it's like almost down to the bottom. So we prefer to look at it this way. It's the exact same data, but this is looking at the average black family's wealth divided by the average white family's wealth. And that's where you get 15% today, or 15 cents on the dollar. And here you can see after 1860, it was 1.8 cents on the dollar. It went up to about 22 cents on the dollar in the early 1990s, but now it's at 15 cents on the dollar, and that's actually where it was in the 1950s. So for this movement around, it's standing about where it was then. And I'll stop there, but happy to take more data questions.
Yeah, this data is truly amazing, and I think it's really important to highlight more recent changes, as a lot of the conversation nationally has sometimes been being in this like post-racial America. So one other question I have is, you all talk a lot about this in your book, but how data can often feel a little bit impersonal, nameless, faceless. But one of the things I love about your work is how you've intertwined the narratives of 7 Black individuals throughout your book. So I was wondering, are there any human stories that you could use to highlight maybe the impact of some of the events you mentioned just now?
Well, that might be a good point for me to give a reading from our book. Louise and I, we interviewed almost 400 people. Some of them were multi-hour interviews. Not just the people that we focused on, but we also spent a lot of time with their families and other people who were experts. So this comes from the preface from our book, and I'll read part of it. It was about 1 a.m. on April 12th, 2022, as he stood outside his home crying tears of rage and disbelief. There wasn't anything to say, really. Nearly 22 years of his life had been spent there. He had fought for it. He had won and lost and won and lost again. Standing in front of his house just after the fire, this was Loveless. Loveless watched the smoke, looked upon the ashes of his dreams. The old man he'd been sheltering was being hauled into an ambulance. When soon afterward the man arrived at Grady Memorial, one of the main hospitals in the city, the local news station carried the story. It reported, "We don't have his age or his name. We do know that he was alive when he showed up here at Grady." The man's name was Carl Phillips, and he had once been a familiar face at the Shepherd's Inn homeless shelter. Located in downtown Atlanta, a 2-minute walk from the National Center for Civil and Human Rights Museum, the shelter welcomed around 400 men per night. Most were Black, like Phillips. COVID-19 had brought more unhoused people to the shelter, some as young as 18. They were not all Atlanta natives. A good number of people had come to Atlanta because of its reputation as the Black Mecca. They told the shelter staff, "I heard Atlanta was a place for me. I came." Rachel Reynolds, a manager at the shelter, told us, "They come to our doors because they have no one else to turn to. Whether that's something that's been done to them or something they have done," she added, "it doesn't really matter." Phillips, the man taken to Grady, was partially blind. He'd been sleeping on the streets of Bankhead, a once white area near downtown that over time had become all Black and in recent times had become famous among rapper fans as the rough neighborhood of the late rapper Shawty Lo. There was a drive-by shooting on his street in the weeks before the fire that sent Phillips to the hospital, but there was also the local dry cleaner shop that it kept track of his disability card for safekeeping and helped him buy groceries for a while. And then there was the Black Bankhead homeowner, James Lewis Lovelace III, who had recently gotten Phillips off the street. After at first putting a couch on his front porch where the man could sleep, Lovelace had eventually taken him in, letting him sleep in one of his bedrooms. That homeowner, Lovelace, had a complex personal story. He had far less privilege in his life than we, the authors of this book, have had. He was born and raised in Atlanta, and by his early 40s, he was spending his afternoons and nights running a small barbecue stand. He had been in and out of prison. He had children, he had dreams. He had fought hard for everything he had and was willing to share it. And then one night, everything he had was gone.
Wow. There's so much in that story and that excerpt. And I guess I'm a little bit curious as to, throughout your story following Lovelace, like what happened with the fire and with Phillips as well?
Well, Mr. Lovelace was involved in a rent-to-own contract with his home. Often people don't necessarily win those, and he was represented by a legal aid attorney. And so there was a twist. You know, I don't want to give it away. There are some moments when you're reading it where you'll say, yes, it looks like it's turning out in his favor. But then there's a twist at the end.
Okay, well, we'll stay tuned for that. And thank you so much for that reading. So I guess turning the page a little bit, we're obviously here at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And one of the really interesting things that I found in some of my research, and I'm sure is highlighted throughout your work, is really the interactions between both public and private actions and how they've impacted the wealth gap over time. I think since we're here at the business school, I'd love to get your perspective on what role have business practices past and present from the 1800s to even the early 2000s played in shaping the Black wealth gap?
There are so many, and we cover this throughout as a thread running through the book. So one of the things that we write about is the early insurance industry. And the early insurance industry, when it came to insuring lives, actually was involved in setting up some of the way people look at pricing of products and ultimately contributing to risk-based pricing models. And those models at the very beginning, and in some ways continuing today, have some bias in them. So we trace that thread. And then we also trace how some of the very people at Prudential and some of the insurance companies who were at the forefront of that in the 1890s became involved in property valuation theories in the early 1900s, which were then incorporated into government FHA manuals and contributed to redlining. So it's all very intertwined. And people say, was it this the government? Was this business? The answer is both. And in fact, some of the same people sometimes working in business and government, people go back and forth in their careers. And so a lot of the thinking goes between the government and business.
Yeah, and one quick follow-up on redlining, which is a topic that we kind of briefly touched on in one of our ethics of pricing classes here at the GSB. And I feel like there was a little bit overlooked when we covered that topic in class. And so I'm just curious for you all, in your work, what has really been the impact of redlining on the housing market, and how has that impacted the black-white wealth gap today?
Well, redlining, as we know, occurred when Black Americans and people of other races were redlined out of neighborhoods. So they were not able to buy homes in certain places. And while it was, an action that you could say, was it business, was it government, even if people were able to go, to a business, to a bank, and, get approval for a loan, they weren't able to move into certain neighborhoods. And so the impact was that in some cases, families weren't able to acquire homes. And we know that home ownership, is one of the ways that wealth is created in our country. So people were locked out of that practice. Louise, would you add something to that, or?
Sure. I think also, there are many ways. First of all, there's plenty of research today that shows that redline neighborhoods have higher incidences of police shootings, more instances of health problems. So it exists very much today that there's an impact to the neighborhood. But the other thing I'll say is whether a neighborhood was redlined or not affected whether people at a key moment in our country could take advantage of big government programs that really created a middle class in America. So one example would be after World War II, the GI Bill was introduced for all veterans, and there had been, I think, 3 million Black Americans who had fought in World War II. And, is that right?
I think it's just north of 1.
Just north of 1 million, sorry. Just north of 1 million Black Americans, you can see who researched that part the most. Just north of 1 million Black Americans who'd fought in World War II. And so anyone who fought in that war was supposed to be able to use money to go to school, buy a home. But in fact, in practice, a lot of Black Americans were not able to use the GI Bill. And some contemporary research from the time shows that only about 3% of the Black Americans who had gone were able to use the bill. And part of the reason they weren't able to use the bill is because banks did not want to lend to redline neighborhoods, but that was the only place they could safely live in many communities. And so that created wealth for white families that has carried through generations. And so that's just one example, but there's a number of ways that redlining did then affect wealth building and government and private programs.
Yeah, those interconnections between the financial systems and the racial wealth gap are really, really insightful. So I guess turning the page to a more positive note, I'm curious, one of the groups that's been getting the most attention on solving the black-white wealth gap is the business community, so many of the folks here in the room. So I also know in your book you covered 3 business people who are aiming to address the black-white wealth gap, and I was wondering if you could share any stories of what you learned by following them.
Well, one of the major issues that we saw in our reporting was, what is the definition of a Black-owned business today? So is it the owners? Is it the board? Is it the customer base they seek to focus on? And so we did cover a television channel that was launched that was to focus on the Black community. And one of the issues that channel had, and it since filed for bankruptcy and was later bought by another entity, was that its owner, it wasn't Black owned. And so you'll see in the book that channel is trying to overcome challenges, it's trying to implement technology. There's some questions about their distribution plans, and you see all of that playing out for them in the time period of the book.
This was the Black News Channel. If you guys heard about the Black News Channel, it launched in early 2020 and was only around for 2 years. But they were trying to focus on Black audiences, content that Black viewers would like, centering the news, and it collapsed. So it was an example of one that did not work. But there are many others. Another that we cover a lot in the book that you'll be reading about is a fintech company, and actually in the fintech space, it's interesting. There's a lot of fintechs that have marketed their products to specific demographic groups. Of all, not just Black Americans, but Latino Americans, or there's apps for Filipino Americans. And so I think by reading our book, it'll make you think more closely about what does it mean when you see a company saying that they're for a specific audience, because we push on that thought a lot in the book.
Yeah, are there any reasons for optimism in some of what you observed? Like, do you feel like ownership is a great path to closing some of the gaps we discussed?
Well, ownership, yes. And I think the challenge is ownership of what? But yes, wealth building often comes through capital and ownership of things. But, is it ownership of homes? Is it ownership of businesses? Is it ownership of stocks? And actually, one of the reasons that the Black-White Wealth Gap has remained very large and not improved so much since the early 1990s is because the stock market has had a really large run-up. And it's less likely that Black Americans who have assets to save put them in stocks versus houses compared to white Americans. And so not as many Black Americans benefited from that.
Okay. All right. I know I asked a lot of questions, but I did want to open the floor up to the audience and our audience on Zoom to see if there are any questions that we didn't cover yet.
Could you tell us something about the family size of the Black family compared to the white family? Because you are comparing family income. So if the size of the family differs across those two groups, that could potentially distort the data.
That's a good question. We didn't look at the size of families, but you're right, we're comparing wealth, household wealth.
I understand, but imagine, not in this example, because I don't know what the data are, but one group has a family size of 2, another one has a family size of 4. You would expect the family size of 4 to have a greater wealth compared to the other one.
We just really didn't look at the family size. But that's a good question, and now it makes me want to go look that up. So thank you.
Thanks so much for being here. You were talking about these businesses that are aiming to kind of for example, provide creative financing for Black families, Latinx families, things like that. I'm struck by the kind of parallel to the rent to own model, because that's historically also been a model that has been advertised on one hand as building bridge home ownership for these communities, yet as you guys pointed out, has been also deeply predatory with all sorts of downstream consequences. So how would you suggest we look at these new waves of businesses that are aiming, hopefully, to try to help these communities and kind of sort the ones that actually can really help these families from those that can harm them?
Well, I think one of the things to think about is if someone says we're trying to help a community or we're trying to, improve the Black-White Wealth Gap, is to really narrow in and say, well, who specifically are they trying to help? One of the issues that Louise and I covered in the reporting of this book is that there were some people who said that they were trying to close the Black-White Wealth Gap, but when we talked with them more, what they were really focused on was maybe higher earners that were Black. And so really getting to the crux of what does it mean and who are the specific targets of an effort, I think is really important.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm a Stanford staff member for all the business school folks who are like, who is this? I'm curious how much you either covered or based on your research sort of have an analysis on solutions like community land trusts as a way to build multi-generational wealth beyond just sort of the one-to-one purchase of homes, or even reparations. There's reparations efforts actually up in Berkeley coming in from the school district level, because there's an analysis of what the impact was of the Black-White Wealth Gap on access to public education. So I'm really curious to hear about how much either you cover in the book or have an analysis around solutions like that.
Great question. We do cover reparations a little bit in the book. we do not take any policy positions in the book. So as journalists, we don't take a particular stance on the policies. We think that the data and the stories being apolitical will really help us reach the most people with this important data, and it's really important that more Americans know it, because actually a very high percentage of Americans think the black-white wealth gap doesn't exist, that there isn't a gap. And we think if more people just knew this data, this is why it's our #1 goal, is to get this data out, then it would affect how they talk about all kinds of policies. But we cover reparations a little bit. We do cover some research on reparations that finds that reparations given of the amount of money of the gap would close the gap. If you give families that amount of money, it would close the gap. But the research did find if you change nothing else, the gap would reopen in a few years. So, any policies or anything anyone would do, it'd be good for, they'd want to understand the multifaceted nature of this gap and how many different things there are, so that, in terms of solutions, we dedicated our afterword to making personal solutions, things everyone could do in their own lives, that again, we think would affect really the way people see the world, and then could affect discussions. And I don't know, do you want to share our first one?
Sure. So one of the personal recommendations that Louise and I have at the end of the book is for people to consider at some point in their life to do a meaningful partnership with someone who's different from them. And a partnership does not mean I hire someone who's different from me and they have to do everything I say. A partnership is two people working together with a shared goal, like we have with this book, that have differences, but also have, a lot at stake together and are working together on the effort. And so that could be, time, money, reputation. If you look at Louise and I, to the visual eye, we are of different races, but we also had other differences that we had to work through to complete this book. Louise lives on the East Coast. I live in Kansas City, Missouri. We are in different time zones. Also, Louise is married and has 3 children. I was widowed in the pandemic. So that meant we also had to navigate family structures. We had to navigate what happens in one household when all of a sudden there are 2 earners, but there become 1, which is what happened in my household. So we just had a lot to navigate, because when you write a book like this, there is an advance that's given up front, but it's not all of the money. And so you'll have to divide it up and figure out, who covers what. And we really had to work hard together through this partnership. But we think if more people worked on a serious effort in partnership with a person who's different from them, they would really impact how they see the world. It would impact their empathy and their understanding of people who are different from them. Would you add anything, Louise?
Well, I agree with all of that. And I'll just say that it comes down to a little bit the difference between equality and equity. And, when you're in a partnership, you want to try to make things fair between the two of you. And I think at the first impulse a lot of people have would be to say that to make it fair, both of you have to do exactly the same thing in the same way. For example, with time spent, you have to both spend the same amount of time. Or with money, you have to spend exactly the same amount of money, expenses or whatever, But we realized over time that actually that wouldn't be very equitable, because it was important for us as partners to understand that we had different situations, and that really being fair was for us to really understand what each person could do in their different ways and value that highly and appreciate that highly. And again, communities, if people understood this in communities, I think that they would understand that it needs to be more give and take between different people, and then it would lead to them thinking differently about things in their company or their community.
Really appreciate your analysis. It's very helpful for me. I feel very concerned, worried, because you talked about us not having access to housing back in the 60s, 70s, that time period after World War II. Then you talk about us missing the stock boom. So I'm thinking now that perhaps the solution is not running the stocks. We missed that boom. In your analysis, your research on potential solutions, did you guys uncover anything that might be what's happening now that we're potentially missing out on as African American?
Well, we're going to stay away from giving financial advice, because we're just not financial advisors.
I'm really more so just calling out the pattern, though. It's like
I
can't
agree
really
with
say do what happened in the past and that'll fix the gap.
I completely echo what you're saying, which is that if you just focus on the past, you're missing what's happening now. And I would just say, in general, the government and companies and society doesn't really look regularly in real time and how new programs are being offered to people and how new products are being taken up by people. So a lot of times, and you'll see this throughout the book, the government will offer something and it's open to everyone, but not everyone really benefits. And same thing in companies. Companies might create something that could be really helpful to their customers, and they're like, well, it's fair, anyone can get it, but they don't like back check and see, are they? So I would encourage, and for you all going to business or if you work in the government, to really push the places you work to do regular analysis along the way of who's benefiting and is it reaching all the people we intend to, and if not, can we rejigger it? So when it comes to financial products, we're not giving financial advice, but let's say you're working in a financial firm that's trying to offer products to all people, you might even challenge yourselves within the firm to, are we making this accessible? Are we reaching all different peoples equally? Are there barriers and reasons that all people aren't able to think about this, what we're doing here?
The data is really sobering that you showed. Is there anything that you came across in your research that is sort of a little bit more hopeful? For example, if you cut the data on age group so that maybe for people today that are younger versus people who are older, somehow when you look at the data, there's something that makes the data look like it's at least heading in the right direction by cohort, or was there nothing that you saw from the data other than sort of it flatlined at roughly 15 cents on the dollar that made you hopeful?
Should I do that? Or I don't think the wealth data is that hopeful, although I'll tell you one little wrinkle on that, but then maybe some other data I think could have some hope. So the wealth data, I don't think it's clear that if it's going to keep going up. Now, if you look at, maybe if you go back to the median, where the pointer, yeah, if you look here, well, this is not the cent on the dollar graphic. If you want, if you get my email, I'll send you some more detailed things. But the median, but this is not showing the gap, this is showing the wealth levels. But the median has been going up in the last few years in a way that the mean hasn't. But where the median is, I think the best one to look at might be kind of here at the end. It's hard to see. I don't have the right one here. But where the median is it's brought it back to the level of 1998. So the median had fallen a lot. It fell going into 2013, and the median has been going up. So if it continued, it might reach some new heights, but it's not clear that what we're going to see 3 years from now with the way things are changing, it's going to go up. But I think that's the trend. When you calculate the trend, it's not that hopeful in the wealth data. And we have also calculated, if you follow the rates of increase on this data out, how long it would take to get to parity, and under different assumptions on the order of like 100 years. So it's quite severe. The data, I will say that if you want to look for the shoots of hope, couple things. One would be business formation data. Because if you can own a successful business, you can create equity in a way you don't through income. And business formation among Black, Latino, non-white people has been up in the last few years. Now, I will caveat and say often when you look at business ownership by race, the number of employees at white-owned businesses is much more. So we're talking about much smaller businesses. But maybe with some people are saying with AI that smaller businesses might be able to break through if they effectively use tools to grow. And so maybe watch that space. And then the other one I would say that has a little bit more hope, but not clear where it will fully lead, is the income data. So a lot of times people talk about income by race, and we've gotten a lot of notes throughout this project, people saying, oh, it looks like the Black-white wealth gap's going away, look at this income data. We're like, well, that's income. But the Black and white income has pretty much converged at the top for top earners. It's very close, there's not such a gap there. It has not converged for the middle and bottom earners. And that's why we say when we talk about the wealth gap closing, like for whom? It has not converged there. But the fact that it has converged on the top could mean that people at the top for whom it's converged, that they're connected, everyone's in a family with a lot of family members, maybe they'll be able to help their families in a way that income, or they'll be able to change the policies at their companies to make it converge in the middle and the bottom. But it has converged there, but there's still big inequities in the middle and the bottom.
Thank you so much for your work. There's a psychologist at Stanford named Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt who writes a lot about racism, and some of the work that she's done is about how giving people information about racial inequality can actually serve to normalize racism and cause detrimental mental health to people learning about racism rather than driving behavioral change. So given that the history is pretty glaring, there's a history of anti-Black racism in the US in the long past, the near past, and the present. What are some examples that you came across in your research of community leaders, economists, business leaders who are taking an innovative approach? Because outside of racial reparations, it seems like there needs to be other stories of hope because the federal government doesn't seem to be passing a bill anytime soon.
Go ahead.
Well, there is a civil rights organization that we cover in the book. And like many organizations that are really old, sometimes organizations have to consider updating and changing their policies or thinking about the current times. And one of the things that we came across in our reporting was that some of the younger volunteers in this organization were pushing for, payment as they were thinking about equity and, who should be paid for what. And we saw that as one of the similar echoes that was raised in some companies by people who were saying, if you do DEI work, should you be paid? And I know this doesn't directly go to your question, but I think seeing some of the people who were in our book that were younger and were saying, what can I do? And them talking with us about things that they were trying to do, to me, that was a little bit hopeful.
And I think what you're also getting at, which is a generational shift, but I think is one that actually can help across racial groups, is there is more public awareness of people should be paid for the things they're doing. And there have been a lot of things in companies where there's a lot of unpaid, unacknowledged work that actually hit different groups differently. So I agree with you that that shift and that push, which we chronicle in one storyline in the book in particular, offers some hope. In terms of like innovative, smaller like approaches in different localities, we can't endorse any of these in particular, but I will say that we have come across a lot of examples of Black Americans who are joining together to buy big plots of land or parcels or communities and leaning into really trying to create more of an internal economy. This is something, and we chronicle through it the book, that came up through history over and again, this question about whether Black Americans want to kind of do their own and try to recirculate money in their own community or try to be integrated and through the white economy do things. But there's definitely been a shift in the last few years, a resurgence. Again, it's an old idea that's come up in Black businesses, supporting Black businesses and carving out. So there's a lot of action like that happening within industries and in communities.
Awesome. So one question we got on Zoom is, can you share any insight from your research regarding property value differentials in redline regions and maybe touch on how those value differentials have changed over time?
We did look at that. I mean, they're pretty stuck. The differentials are very severe. And it's not only necessarily due to a neighborhood, so you see it between redlined and non-redlined, but you also see it sometimes within the same neighborhood. There's appraisal differences. There have been many documented cases when a Black family versus a white family lives in the same house. And you guys have probably read the news stories about some Black families, for example, who have gotten one appraisal, and then they take their photos down and they put photos of a white family up, and then they get a higher appraisal.
Thanks so much for the sobering conversation. I'm gonna push in, and I hope it's taken with like the spirit of respect. But I think like amplifying the question that was asked before, I think like I have a complicated relationship with journalism in general, because I think there is a hard line to toe between like presenting important facts without biasing them, but also you kind of leave the rest of the world to come up with the solutions. And I wonder in the situation where like there might actually be harm or normalization as an impact of presenting this information without like solutions. If we just say like, hey, this is happening, maybe it's just something we get used to. How do you think about, this is a really not an easy question, but how do you think about your kind of responsibility towards the impact of this information on broader society? And like then how do you think about presenting this just as a set of critical facts versus presenting it with like context solutions and options?
Well, one of the things that we've been trying to do is to go to communities and have conversations face to face so that people understand the 15 cents on the dollar statistic. As Louise mentioned, that's our number one goal for this project. And we think that that gives us an opportunity to answer people's questions to the best that we're able. While we don't give policy recommendations as journalists, we hope that by shining a light on these stories in this book and also on the data, that it will create a situation where people and communities will be armed with the information and that they will want to take what action they think is appropriate.
And I'll add to that though. So we've been holding these public racial wealth gap symposiums around the country. We've done them in Kansas City, Orlando, Austin, Texas. We did a 2-day symposium in Montgomery, Alabama. We have a big event coming up next week in Roxbury, which is a historic Black neighborhood of Boston. And then we, on Juneteenth, have a public event in Times Square. We'll be in DC, Atlanta. For all of those events where they're public and then we're organizing them, we're actually, every single one of those events has us present this data, but then we have selected panels of regional interesting leaders in the space who are working on it, and we then moderate a panel with them where we try to bring up their voices and bring out different perspectives. So sorry that we don't have that today, and we're so thrilled to be here, but I agree with you that it is better to pair this information also with people within a community that attendees can reach out to and get involved with if they want. Like, for example, in our Juneteenth one in New York, we'll also even have New York Cares is going to be there, and they're going to highlight to people there things today in New York they could do that touch on this issue. So I agree with your point, and we're working really hard to present this information with other people who can share that. And I'll just also tell you on a personal level, you know, working on all this and seeing kind of, you know, how troubling the data is, right? And I felt, and Ebony has her own version of this, I felt coming out of this like I wanted to be involved in something that also would be very helpful. And so it turned out a lot of people in our book were affected by the justice system. We did not know going in when we selected the people to be in the book that so many of them would be, because unlike James Loveless, who we knew he had gone to prison, but other people we feature, it turns out they had fathers or people related to them that we would find out only after multiple interviews. And so coming out of the book, you know, I saw also for all those families, their wealth was impacted by the fact that their fathers, for example, for years were not earning income and were mounting debts, and got out of prison and couldn't really get jobs. So actually, I'm involved with an organization now called Prison Journalism Project, and we train people in prison to do journalism and in writing, and even if they come out and they want to do something else, it's good skills. And actually, if you did not get one of the free copies, I hope when you'll come up and purchase the book after. We have multiple options here, the Black-owned bookstore, Amazon, but then we also have this one, and all of the proceeds from book sales here go to the Prison Journalism Project, and also in general, just so you know, it's written in our book, you'll see we've made a big commitment, profits going to nonprofits. So anyways, also on a personal level, I hear what you're saying, and I kind of looked at, well, what can I, within my journalism ethics, do also on this?
And I'll just add to that I am the Chief Strategy Officer at the Marshall Project, which is a news nonprofit that covers the criminal justice system in the United States. We are a distributed model with journalists across the country. And Louise and I are hosting an event in Washington, D.C. on June 21st. It's on our website. And we're doing that also in partnership with the Marshall Project. And the topic of that is the financial punishment that people experience when they have moved through the justice system.
I'm wondering what educational reforms you see coming out of this. I got the invitation through the GSE, and I'm an educator who spent 7 years in a K-8 institution. And the last year I've spent here in East Palo Alto, and I really resonated with this idea of redlining, right? And, you know, people of color carrying that burden. So as an educator who commutes from Palo Alto to East Palo Alto, I experienced the transition in the difference of experiences. And every single day, I'm dealing with 60 kids, 4th and 5th grade class, because an educator gave up on them at the beginning of the year. And it's hard to find educators that will take a $70,000 job. So I think this question is also kind of embedded to a message to all y'all business people to invest in educators who are doing the real footwork every single day. You know, I'm carrying the emotional baggage of 60 plus kids and families So if I can ask you a ChatGPT question, how would I explain this to my fifth graders, right? Like how can I, to your point about building partnerships with other people, how can I empower my students to look at other people in the room as a partner? You may be different from me, but we're a partner. And then just adding another, layer of nuance, most of the school is 99% Latino, right? Something I've realized from my own experience and just their experiences, there's a lot of racist humor that is embedded into the Mexican culture. And I see that every single day. So how do I get them to really build partnerships with people that they don't see on a daily basis because they've been redlined by the country, right? So again, like how do I explain this to kids and make them really do something with it?
Well, one thing I'll just note is the Latino white wealth gap, just so you have this figure, is 22 cents on the dollar right now. I will tell you though, I think that is higher than it really is because of the data not necessarily including undocumented people. So I think one of the most important things for kids is to be with kids from all different communities and not to be isolated and segregated as kids. And in doing this project over the last few years, and it's been a very intensive project, we've also both reflected a little bit on like, what is it that made us decide to do this? And I hadn't thought about it as such, but I did reflect about a year in that my own public school education, which was in Florida, had a big impact on my outlook. And I went to a public elementary school on the border of Eatonville and Maitland, Florida, and Eatonville is where Zora Neale Hurston's from. And so about 40% of my school were Black Americans, which is a lot higher than the population. And so as a child, I was just I wasn't in a segregated situation within my school. And so I know you can't control the makeup of your school, but I guess I would wonder, like, are there any ways that you could work with the school and with other schools to try to have some cross-mingling or partnerships and things just to bring kids together with other kids?
Thank you for this data. So my question is more, I'm gonna make a general statement and then hopefully you can correct the general statement, yeah? So is it feasible that maybe the family unit in the Black family, right? These majority, and again, general statements, might be majority single family households. And then how could the gender income ratio, like so for example, you're showing the Black on white right here, right? But the women male income, how does this trend compared to the black white ratio?
So Black women face the income and the wealth gap. So with the data that Louise showed about the wealth gap, that is not broken out by gender, because when the federal government reports the wealth data, it doesn't separate out men and women in the same household. But we know from earnings data that women earn less than men, and we know that women of color, earn less than white women. I sit on the board of United We in Kansas City, which formerly was named the Women's Foundation of Kansas City, and one of its goals is to improve the economics and civic empowerment for women. When we look at census data for Black households, we know that data tells us that Black households are less likely to be married when compared to white households. So the question you ask is a good one, because I think what you're hinting at is, are the households more likely to be headed by women, more likely to be single, and how that may play into this situation. And so it is true that there is a marriage gap. And then there's also, frankly, a widow gap. There's also data that suggests that it's from the census, that Black people are more likely to be widowed. And part of that has to do with life expectancy for Black men. So when you really drill in on the household, there are many issues facing Black women, and income and wealth are areas that they face.
My question is, if you had, like a magic wand and you could find any data that you weren't able to get, like what would that have been?
A few things. The historical data back to 1860 is only comparing average families. There's not distributional data before 1989. So I think it'd be really interesting to see if there was a difference with the median and different distribution levels earlier in history. So that's one. I also think actually this current conversation, a lot more breaking into family structure, and if there were a way to break it up by gender would be really interesting. One of the things that in our, personal recommendations of the book we call for is we think that there should be more wealth transparency. So we urge people to think about in all aspects of where they are, like supporting transparency. Because when you think as a society, there's so much attention on unemployment and jobs data and GDP growth, but actually the government doesn't release much data and doesn't release it very often. This is every 3 years on wealth, and it's not really covered. It's not really a focus of companies or the press very much. And so just imagine if there was like a wealth report and more focus on it. Part of the reason the government doesn't release more is they don't have more. When you file returns, the inheritance tax would be one where people see where the government sees wealth, but there's not race recorded on it, and there's not. So we think just more data in general would be helpful to understanding this.
One last question before we depart. So many of us in the room, including myself, are getting ready to graduate in a few short weeks. So I'm curious, in addition to what you've already shared, is there any advice you would have for folks in the room who are getting ready to re-enter the real world again and take on high-powered jobs, I think, with the ambition of becoming impactful business leaders? Like, what would you recommend?
Well, I'm also an MBA, my MBA at Yale. And I guess I would say, one of the things people really are excited about when they go to a great business school like Stanford or Yale is the network that you get there and the connections that you make. And that's really terrific. But I would just encourage you, don't get yourself off into a professional bubble as you go along where you're basically now just connected to your Stanford network and then this, company you go work at, now you're in that network. Try to find ways to keep reaching out and reaching to people who aren't in those networks so that the work you're doing can benefit not only yourself, but potentially other people.
And I'll keep it simple. Just please give consideration to our suggestion about a personal partnership.
Thank you guys so much, and thank you to our audience.